Sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us disguised as ordinary strangers. They carry worn briefcases instead of designer bags, wear simple clothes instead of expensive suits, and speak softly instead of demanding attention. We pass them on busy streets, stand behind them in coffee shop lines, and sit next to them on public transportation without ever knowing we're in the presence of greatness. This is the story of Dr. Margaret Shun, a woman whose appearance deceived everyone who saw her that cold Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. While others rushed past in their polished shoes and tailored coats, she walked slowly, carefully balancing a stack of manila folders against her chest. Her clothes were modest, her hair simply pulled back, and her shoes showed signs of countless miles walked in service of something far greater than anyone around her could imagine. The small bronze medal on her wrist caught no one's attention that morning. It was partially hidden beneath her sleeve, worn and tarnished from years of wear. To the casual observer, it might have looked like simple jewelry, perhaps a gift from a grandchild or a souvenir from some long-forgotten vacation. But that small piece of metal carried within it a story of courage, sacrifice, and honor that would leave even the most cynical person speechless. What happened in the next few hours would challenge every assumption those around her had made about worth, respect, and the true meaning of heroism. It would remind everyone present that dignity has nothing to do with designer labels, that wisdom doesn't always come wrapped in expensive packaging, and that sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones who speak the softest. This is her story, a reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes that book contains chapters of courage we could never imagine. Dr. Margaret Shun stepped off the city bus at Michigan Avenue, clutching her worn leather briefcase in one hand and balancing a stack of manila folders in the other. The October wind cut through her simple navy coat as she made her way down the busy sidewalk toward the towering glass building that housed the city's most prestigious medical conference center. At 68 years old, Margaret moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite physical limitations that weren't immediately visible to strangers. Her left leg, injured decades ago in circumstances she rarely discussed, caused her to walk with a slight limp that became more pronounced when she was tired or stressed. This morning, after working until 3 in the morning to prepare her presentation, both conditions applied. The file she carried contained 5 years of research that could revolutionize how doctors treated battlefield trauma. Her work with emergency medicine in conflict zones had led to discoveries that were already saving lives in military hospitals around the world, but today she hoped to bring that knowledge to civilian emergency rooms across the country. As she approached the conference center's main entrance, Margaret paused to adjust her grip on the folders. The bronze medal on her wrist caught on one of the file tabs, and she took a moment to carefully untangle it. The medal was small and understated, worn smooth by decades of wear. Most people never noticed it, which was exactly how Margaret preferred things. Behind her, a group of young residents from Chicago General Hospital were also heading to the same conference. They were dressed in expensive suits and carried sleek tablet computers instead of paper files. Dr. James Mitchell, a third-year resident with perfectly styled hair and a watch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, noticed Margaret struggling with her files. "Look at that old lady," he whispered to his colleague, Dr. Sarah Kim. "Probably someone's grandmother who got lost looking for the bingo hall." Dr. Kim, who was usually more thoughtful than her friend, nonetheless found herself smiling at the comment. Margaret did look out of place among the sharply dressed medical professionals streaming into the building. Her coat was clean but obviously old. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and those manila folders seemed almost quaint in an era of digital presentations and cloud storage. "Maybe she's here to clean the conference rooms," suggested Dr. Rachel Torres, the third member of their group. "Though I'm not sure why she'd need all those files for that." The 3 residents quickened their pace to pass Margaret, who had paused again to rest her folders on a nearby bench. As they walked by, Dr. Mitchell made sure his voice was loud enough for her to hear. "Some people really need to learn their place, don't they? This conference is for medical professionals, not random people off the street." Margaret heard every word, but she had long ago learned to let such comments roll off her like water off a duck's back. She had faced far worse than the ignorant assumptions of young doctors who equated worth with appearance. Instead of responding, she simply adjusted her grip on her files once more and continued toward the entrance. Inside the conference center's marble lobby, The scene was one of controlled chaos. Hundreds of doctors, nurses, researchers, and medical students milled about, checking their schedules, grabbing coffee, and networking with colleagues. The noise level was considerable, with conversations in multiple languages mixing with the clicking of heels on marble floors and the constant ping of smartphones receiving messages. Margaret made her way to the registration desk, where a harried volunteer was trying to manage a computer system that seemed determined not to cooperate. The young woman behind the desk looked up with barely concealed impatience as Margaret approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting that helping was the last thing she wanted to do at that moment. "I'm here to register for the conference," Margaret replied quietly. "Dr. Margaret Chun." The volunteer's fingers flew over the keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. After several long moments, she looked up with confusion. "I'm not seeing your name in our attendee database. Are you sure you're registered for this conference?" Margaret set her files down on the counter and reached into her briefcase for her confirmation letter. "I should be in the speaker database, not the general attendee list," she explained patiently. This caused the volunteer to look even more confused. She glanced at Margaret's simple clothes and worn briefcase, then back at her computer screen. "Speaker database? What presentation are you supposed to give?" "Battlefield Trauma Protocols in Civilian Emergency Medicine," Margaret replied. "It's the keynote address for this afternoon's session." The volunteer's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She looked Margaret up and down once more, taking in every detail of her appearance with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake. The keynote speakers for this conference are all world-renowned experts in their fields. Perhaps you're thinking of a different event." Margaret remained calm, despite the volunteer's obvious doubt. She had dealt with similar situations countless times over the years. "Could you please check under the speaker list?" she asked. "My presentation is scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main auditorium." With obvious reluctance, the volunteer switched to a different screen on her computer. Her fingers moved more slowly this time, as if she was hoping to prove Margaret wrong and end this embarrassing conversation. But as she scrolled through the speaker database, her expression began to change. "Oh," she said softly, staring at her screen. Then, more loudly, "Oh my." Dr. Mitchell and his colleagues, who had been standing nearby discussing their plans for the day, overheard the conversation and moved closer. They were curious to see how this situation would resolve itself, expecting to witness the gentle removal of a confused elderly woman who had wandered into the wrong building. "Is there a problem?" Dr. Mitchell asked the volunteer, injecting just enough authority into his voice to suggest that he was someone important who might be able to help resolve the situation. The volunteer looked up at him, then back at Margaret, then at her computer screen again. She seemed to be struggling with something, her finger hovering over the mouse, as if she wasn't sure what to click next. Well, the computer shows." She began, then stopped and started again. "Ma'am, could you please show me some identification? Just to confirm your identity." Margaret nodded and reached in her briefcase once more, pulling out her driver's license and medical license. As she handed them over, the bronze medal on her wrist became more visible, catching the lobby's bright lights. Dr. Kim noticed the medal first. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at Margaret's wrist. "Some kind of medical award?" Margaret glanced down at her wrist, then looked back up at the group of young doctors who were now all staring at her with curious expressions. "It's just an old medal," she said quietly. "Nothing important." But Dr. Torres, who had been squinting at the medal with growing recognition, suddenly went very pale. She grabbed Dr. Kim's arm and whispered something urgent in her ear, her eyes never leaving Margaret's wrist. Dr. Kim's expression changed from curiosity to shock to something approaching horror as she realized what her friend had seen. She tugged on Dr. Mitchell's sleeve, trying to get his attention, but he was still focused on the volunteer at the registration desk. The volunteer, meanwhile, had been examining Margaret's identification cards with increasing bewilderment. She kept looking back and forth between the documents and her computer screen as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Dr. Chun," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says here that you were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor." Margaret finished quietly. "Yes, that's correct." The lobby didn't exactly fall silent, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere around the registration desk. Several nearby conversations stuttered to a halt as people caught fragments of what was being said. The words Medal of Honor had a way of cutting through background noise like a knife through butter. Dr. Mitchell finally turned his attention back to the conversation, just in time to hear Margaret's confirmation. His face went through a rapid series of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to dawning realization to complete mortification. The Medal of Honor, he repeated, his voice cracking slightly, as in the military's highest decoration for valor. Margaret nodded simply. I was a combat medic, she explained. A long time ago. The volunteer at the registration desk was now frantically scrolling through additional screens on her computer, her previous skepticism replaced by obvious panic. Dr. Chun, I am so sorry for the confusion. Your registration is here, and your speaker credentials, and oh my goodness, you're not just giving a keynote. You're receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American College of Emergency Physicians. Margaret accepted this information with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the entire exchange. Thank you, she said simply. Could I have my room assignment for the presentation setup? But before the volunteer could respond, Dr. Torres stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. Dr. Chun, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I need to apologize. We said some terrible things about you, and we had no right to judge you based on your appearance. Margaret turned to look at the three young residents, taking in their expensive clothes, their obvious discomfort, and their genuine remorse. She had seen this before too, though it never got easier to watch young people grapple with their own prejudices and assumptions. What you said wasn't about me, she replied gently. It was about your own expectations and biases. We all have them. The important thing is what we do when we recognize them. Dr. Mitchell, who had been standing frozen in place since hearing about the Medal of Honor, finally found his voice. Dr. Chun, what we said was inexcusable. There's no justification for treating anyone the way we treated you, regardless of their background or achievements. Margaret studied his face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse there along with something else, something that might have been a teachable moment. Dr. Mitchell, she said, can I ask you something? When you see a patient in the emergency room, what do you see first? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Do you see their clothes? Their jewelry? Whether they can afford good shoes, or whether they drove to the hospital in an expensive car? Or do you see a human being who needs your help? Dr. Mitchell's face reddened as he began to understand where she was going with this question. I see a patient who needs help, he said quietly. Exactly, Margaret replied. And that patient might be a billionaire or a homeless person, a war hero, or someone who's never left their hometown, a genius, or someone who struggles to read. But in that moment, none of that matters except their need for your skills and your compassion. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The problem comes when we stop seeing patients and start seeing categories. When we decide that someone's worth is determined by their appearance rather than their humanity. Dr. Kim stepped forward then, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. You're talking about us, aren't you? About how we looked at you and saw a category instead of a person. Margaret nodded slowly. I've been in emergency medicine for over 40 years, she said. I've seen doctors save the lives of patients they initially dismissed based on appearance. I've also seen doctors miss critical diagnoses because they made assumptions about someone's intelligence or background based on how they looked or spoke. The volunteer at the registration desk, who had been listening to this exchange with growing fascination, finally found her voice again. Dr. Chun, your room is set up in conference room A, and we have audiovisual technicians standing by to help with your presentation setup. Is there anything else you need? Margaret picked up her files once more, adjusting her grip carefully to avoid another tangle with her medal. Just a quiet place to review my notes one more time, she said, and perhaps a cup of coffee if possible. As she began to walk away from the registration desk, Dr. Torres called after her. Dr. Chun, would it be possible? Could we attend your presentation this afternoon? I think we have a lot to learn from you. Margaret turned back with a small smile, the first real smile she had shown since arriving at the conference. Of course, she said, but I should warn you, I'm going to be talking about some difficult subjects. Combat medicine isn't always easy to hear about. We understand, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice more respectful than it had been all morning. And Dr. Chun, thank you for the lesson. I think I needed to hear it. Margaret nodded once more and continued on her way, her files tucked securely against her chest, her bronze medal catching the light as she walked. Behind her, the three residents stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about assumptions, prejudices, and the difference between seeing and truly looking. The volunteer at the registration desk watched Dr. Chun disappear into the crowd, then turned to her computer and pulled up the biographical information that had been submitted with the speaker applications. What she read there made her shake her head in amazement at how close they had all come to dismissing someone truly extraordinary based on nothing more than appearance and assumptions. As the morning wore on and word spread through the conference about the incident at the registration desk, more and more people began to take notice of the quiet woman with the manila folders and the bronze medal. But by then, Margaret had found her quiet corner and her coffee and was deep in preparation for a presentation that would challenge everything her audience thought they knew about emergency medicine, human courage, and the true meaning of service. The main auditorium of the Chicago Medical Conference Center buzzed with anticipation as doctors, nurses, and medical students filed in for the afternoon keynote presentation. Word had spread quickly through the conference about the morning's incident at the registration desk, and Dr. Margaret Chin's name was on everyone's lips. Some came out of curiosity, others out of professional interest, and still others because they had heard whispers about the small bronze medal and wanted to see the woman who wore it for themselves. Margaret stood behind the stage curtain, her manila folders now organized on a small table beside the podium. She had traded her navy coat for a simple black blazer, but her appearance remained understated compared to the polished speakers who had preceded her throughout the day. In her hands, she held a small remote control for her presentation slides, though anyone watching closely would have noticed that her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped it. Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference director, approached Margaret with a warm but concerned expression. "Dr. Chun, is everything ready for your presentation? I heard about the unfortunate misunderstanding this morning, and I want to personally apologize for any discourtesy you experienced." Margaret looked up from her notes with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Dr. Williams, but there's no need to apologize for other people's assumptions. I've found that such moments often provide the most valuable teaching opportunities. Still," Dr. Williams continued, "I want you to know that the entire conference committee holds you in the highest regard. Your research on battlefield trauma protocols has already saved countless lives, and we're honored to have you here." Through the curtain, Margaret could hear the audience settling into their seats. The auditorium held over 800 people, and from the sound of it, every seat was filled. She had spoken to large audiences before, but something about this particular crowd felt different. There was an energy in the air, an expectation that went beyond the usual academic interest in a medical presentation. "Dr. Chun," Dr. Williams said, checking her watch, "we're ready to begin whenever you are." Margaret nodded, straightening her blazer and checking once more that her medal was properly positioned on her wrist. It had become a habit over the years, this unconscious touch of the small bronze circle that represented so much more than most people would ever know. As Dr. Williams walked onto the stage to introduce her, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself to remember. She thought of a field hospital in Vietnam, nearly 5 decades ago, where a young combat medic named Margaret Chun had made decisions that would haunt and inspire her for the rest of her life. She thought of the soldiers she had saved, the ones she couldn't save, and the moment when everything changed forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Williams's voice carried clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Margaret Chun. Dr. Chun is not only a pioneering researcher in emergency trauma medicine, but also a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for extraordinary heroism during the Vietnam War." A hush fell over the auditorium. In the third row, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Torres sat with their notebooks open, but their pens remained still as they absorbed this information. Around them, other audience members shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with sudden attention. Dr. Chin's presentation today, titled "Battlefield Trauma Protocols in Civilian Emergency Medicine," draws from her unique experience as both a combat medic and a leading researcher in trauma care. Her work has revolutionized how we approach emergency medicine in both military and civilian settings, and her insights have been instrumental in reducing mortality rates in emergency departments across the country. Margaret walked onto the stage as applause filled the auditorium. She moved with quiet confidence, her slight limp more noticeable under the bright stage lights. As she approached the podium, she set her remote control down carefully and looked out at the sea of faces before her. For a moment, the auditorium was completely silent. Margaret's presence at the podium seemed to command a respect that went beyond mere professional courtesy. There was something about her stillness, her calm demeanor, that made everyone in the audience feel as though they were in the presence of someone who had seen things they could barely imagine. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Before I begin my formal presentation, I'd like to share something with you. This morning, I had an encounter that reminded me why the work we do as medical professionals is so important, not just in terms of the procedures we perform or the diagnoses we make, but in how we see and treat the human beings who come to us for help." She clicked her remote, and the first slide appeared on the large screen behind her. It showed a simple photo of a military field hospital with tents and medical equipment visible in the dusty landscape. This photograph was taken in 1968 at a field hospital in Vietnam where I serve as a combat medic. I was 21 years old, fresh out of medical training, and absolutely certain that I knew everything I needed to know about emergency medicine. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, but they were respectful, acknowledging the universal experience of youthful overconfidence that most medical professionals could relate to. What I learned in that field hospital changed not only how I practice medicine, but how I see every patient who comes through the doors of an emergency room. And what I learned began with a single moment that I want to share with you today. Margaret clicked to the next slide, which showed a close-up photo of her Medal of Honor, the Bronze Star surrounded by its distinctive blue ribbon. On March 15, 1968, our field hospital came under enemy fire. We had been treating wounded soldiers for 18 straight hours when the attack began. The incoming wounded were arriving faster than we could treat them, and we had to make impossible decisions about who to help first. The auditorium was completely quiet now. Even those who had come simply out of curiosity found themselves drawn into Margaret's story, her calm voice carrying them back to a time and place that most could barely comprehend. Among the wounded was a North Vietnamese soldier who had been captured and injured during the fighting. He was brought in unconscious, with severe abdominal injuries that required immediate surgery if he was to survive. At the same time, we had American soldiers with equally serious wounds waiting for treatment. Margaret paused, letting this dilemma sink in with her audience. Some of my colleagues felt that we should treat our own soldiers first. It seemed logical, even patriotic. But as I looked at that unconscious enemy soldier, I saw something that changed my perspective forever. I saw a human being who was bleeding, who was in pain, and who would die without immediate medical intervention. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a simple diagram of the human circulatory system. In that moment, I realized that blood is just blood. Pain is just pain. The need for medical care doesn't recognize nationality, political ideology, or which uniform someone happens to be wearing. Medicine is about preserving human life, period. Dr. Kim found herself leaning forward in her seat, completely absorbed in the story. Around the auditorium, other audience members were having similar reactions, drawn into a narrative that was both personal and universal. I made the decision to operate on the North Vietnamese soldier first, because his injuries were slightly more critical. It was not a popular choice with some people, but it was the right choice medically. And during that surgery, while enemy mortar rounds exploded around our tent, I learned something profound about what it means to be a doctor. Margaret's voice remained steady, but those watching closely could see the emotion in her eyes as she continued. The soldier survived the surgery, but he woke up confused and frightened. He didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Vietnamese, but when he saw me changing his bandages, he reached out and touched my hand. In his eyes, I saw gratitude, but I also saw something else. I saw the recognition of our shared humanity. She clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics about survival rates in combat medicine. 3 days later, our position was overrun. During the evacuation, that same North Vietnamese soldier, despite his injuries, helped me carry wounded Americans to the evacuation helicopters. He could have escaped in the chaos, but instead he chose to help save the lives of soldiers who had been fighting against him. The auditorium was so quiet that the slight hum of the air conditioning seemed loud by comparison. Margaret's story had transported her audience to that distant battlefield, making them feel the weight of decisions that most would never have to face. I received the Medal of Honor not for that surgery, but for what happened during the evacuation. When our position was being overrun, I stayed behind to treat the wounded while others evacuated to safety. But I want you to understand that the real heroism that day came from recognizing that our enemy was also our patient, and that medical ethics transcend the boundaries of war. Margaret clicked to her next slide, which showed modern emergency room statistics. Now, you might be wondering what this 40-year-old war story has to do with civilian emergency medicine in 2024. The answer is everything. Every day, in emergency rooms across this country, we make decisions about who to treat first, how to allocate limited resources, and how to maintain our professional standards under pressure. She began to walk slowly across the stage as she spoke, her slight limp more evident, but somehow adding gravity to her words. And every day we are confronted with patients who challenge our assumptions, our biases, and our preconceptions. The homeless man who smells of alcohol might be a veteran suffering from PTSD. The well-dressed businessman who demands immediate attention might be a drug seeker. The quiet elderly woman with simple clothes might be a retired surgeon who knows more about medicine than half the residents in your program. Dr. Mitchell felt his face grow warm as he realized the personal application of Margaret's words. The protocols we use for trauma treatment in emergency medicine today are based on principles I first learned in that field hospital in Vietnam. We treat the most critically injured first, regardless of who they are or where they come from. We focus on preserving life and alleviating suffering, not on making moral judgments about who deserves our care. Margaret returned to the podium and clicked to a slide showing her research data. But beyond the medical protocols, there's something equally important that we must carry with us every day. We must remember to see the human being behind every patient. We must resist the temptation to judge based on appearance, accent, insurance status, or any other external factor. She looked directly at the section of the audience where Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Torres were sitting, though her expression remained kind and non-accusatory. This morning, I experienced firsthand how easy it is for medical professionals to make assumptions based on appearance. Young doctors saw an elderly woman with simple clothes and immediately assumed I didn't belong in their sophisticated medical conference. Their reaction was understandable, but it was also dangerous. Margaret clicked to her next slide, which showed statistics about misdiagnoses related to patient bias. Studies show that diagnostic errors occur more frequently when doctors make initial judgments about patients based on non-medical factors. We see this in emergency rooms when patients are dismissed as drug seekers because of their appearance, when chest pain in women is misdiagnosed because we expect heart attacks to present differently in female patients, or when elderly patient symptoms are attributed to aging rather than investigated as potential serious conditions. The audience was completely engaged now, taking notes and nodding as they recognized the truth of what Margaret was describing. The battlefield taught me that in moments of crisis, our training and our humanity must work together. We cannot afford to let prejudice cloud our medical judgment, because the cost of such errors is measured in human lives. Margaret spent the next 30 minutes presenting her research data, showing how battlefield trauma protocols have been adapted for civilian emergency medicine. She discussed everything from triage procedures to rapid response techniques, from resource management to team communication under pressure. But throughout the technical presentation, she continued to weave in the human element, reminding her audience that behind every statistic was a person whose life depended on their skill, judgment, and compassion. In conclusion, Margaret said, clicking to her final slide, which showed a simple photo of hands performing CPR, emergency medicine is ultimately about one human being helping another in their darkest moment. All of our technology, all of our protocols, all of our training is meaningless if we forget that fundamental truth. She paused, looking out at the audience once more. The medal I wear on my wrist represents a moment when I chose to see humanity rather than enemy, when I chose to heal rather than harm, when I chose to stay rather than leave. But every day, in emergency rooms across the country, doctors and nurses make similar choices. They may not receive medals for their decisions, but their courage and compassion save lives just as surely as any battlefield heroism. As Margaret concluded her presentation, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. But this was not the polite, professional applause that typically followed academic presentations. This was something deeper, more emotional, the kind of applause that acknowledged not just expertise, but wisdom not just knowledge but character. Dr. Torres found herself wiping away tears as she clapped, overwhelmed by the realization of how close they had come to dismissing someone whose life experience and wisdom could teach them more than any textbook ever could. Dr. Williams returned to the stage for the question and answer session, but before she could speak, a hand shot up in the audience. It belonged to Dr. Mitchell, who stood up despite his obvious nervousness. "Dr. Chun," he said, his voice carrying clearly through his microphone, "I was one of the doctors who made assumptions about you this morning, and I want to publicly apologize not just to you, but to everyone here who witnessed my lack of professionalism and basic human decency." Margaret nodded graciously, but before she could respond, Dr. Mitchell continued. "My question is this: how do we, as medical professionals, train ourselves to recognize and overcome our unconscious biases? How do we learn to see what you saw in that battlefield, the humanity in every patient regardless of the circumstances?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "Dr. Mitchell, the fact that you're asking that question suggests you're already on the right path. Recognizing bias is the first step toward overcoming it. But beyond that, I think it requires constant practice and curiosity rather than judgment." She walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the audience. Instead of looking at a patient and immediately forming conclusions about who they are or what they need, try asking questions. Not just medical questions, but human questions. What brought them to your emergency room today? What fears do they have? What hopes? When you approach each patient as a mystery to be solved rather than a category to be managed, you'll find that your diagnostic skills improve along with your compassion. More hands went up around the auditorium as doctors and nurses began sharing their own experiences with patient bias and asking for guidance on specific situations they had encountered. The question and answer session continued for over an hour, far longer than originally scheduled, but no one in the auditorium showed any signs of wanting to leave. Margaret's presentation had opened a conversation that many in the audience had been needing to have for years. The conference center's main lobby had transformed into an impromptu gathering space following Margaret's presentation. Small groups of medical professionals clustered around high-top tables, their voices animated as they discussed what they had just heard. The energy in the room was different from the typical post-presentation atmosphere, charged with something more meaningful than academic curiosity. Margaret sat in a quiet corner of the lobby, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as a steady stream of doctors, nurses, and medical students approached her table. Each person who sat across from her brought their own story, their own questions, their own need to process what her presentation had stirred up inside them. Dr. Patricia Williams had tried several times to escort Margaret to the VIP lounge, but Margaret had politely declined each invitation. "This is where the real learning happens," she had explained, gesturing toward the busy lobby. "Not in private rooms with other speakers, but here with the people who will carry these conversations back to their hospitals and clinics." Dr. Sarah Kim approached Margaret's table hesitantly, her conference program clutched in her hands like a security blanket. She had been standing nearby for nearly 10 minutes, working up the courage to interrupt what appeared to be a deep conversation between Margaret and a group of emergency room nurses from Detroit. When the nurses finally departed, Dr. Kim slipped into the vacant chair across from Margaret. "Dr. Chun, I hope I'm not bothering you. I know you must be exhausted after that presentation." Margaret looked up with a gentle smile, the same expression she had worn throughout the afternoon as she patiently answered questions and listened to stories. "Not at all, Dr. Kim. Please sit. How can I help you?" Dr. Kim struggled with where to begin. The morning's incident at the registration desk felt like it had happened weeks ago rather than hours, but the shame of it still burned in her chest. "I want to talk to you about this morning, but also about something else. Something your presentation brought up for me." Margaret nodded encouragingly, settling back in her chair with the patience of someone who understood that important conversations couldn't be rushed. "My grandmother came to this country from Korea in 1952, Dr. Kim began slowly. "She didn't speak English well, and she always dressed very simply because she didn't have much money. When I was in medical school, I used to be embarrassed when she would visit me at the hospital. She looked so out of place among all the doctors and nurses in their professional clothes." Margaret listened without judgment, recognizing the pain in the young doctor's voice. "She died 2 years ago, and it wasn't until today that I realized I was ashamed of her for the same reasons we were dismissive of you this morning." I looked at her, and saw someone who didn't fit my idea of what belonged in a medical setting. Instead of seeing someone who had survived war, immigration, and poverty to build a life in a new country. Dr. Kim paused, her eyes filling with tears. She was probably braver than I'll ever be, but I was too focused on appearances to see it. Margaret reached across the table and gently touched the younger woman's hand. Dr. Kim, can I tell you something about courage? Real courage isn't always obvious. Sometimes it looks like a quiet elderly woman riding the bus to the hospital to visit her granddaughter, even though she feels out of place and uncomfortable. Sometimes it looks like a young doctor who's willing to examine her own biases and admit when she's been wrong. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. James Mitchell, who had been waiting respectfully nearby for an opportunity to join them. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something more thoughtful and uncertain. Dr. Chun, Dr. Kim, he said quietly, would it be appropriate for me to join this conversation? I have something I need to say, but I don't want to intrude. Margaret gestured to an empty chair. Please sit. I think we're all learning from each other here. Dr. Mitchell sat down heavily, as if the weight of the afternoon's revelations had physically exhausted him. I've been thinking about what happened this morning, and about your presentation, and I keep coming back to this question. How do I know what other assumptions I'm making that I'm not even aware of? It was a profound question, one that Margaret had wrestled with herself for decades. That's perhaps the most important question you could ask, she replied, because the assumptions we're most unaware of are often the ones that do the most damage. She took a sip of her lukewarm tea before continuing. In Vietnam, I thought I understood what courage looked like. I expected it to be loud and obvious, like charging in a battle or making dramatic sacrifices. But some of the bravest people I met there were quiet, almost invisible. The Vietnamese translators who risked their lives to help us communicate with local villagers. The supply clerks who worked 18-hour days to make sure we had the equipment we needed. The medics who held dying soldiers' hands so they wouldn't die alone. Dr. Kim leaned forward, drawn into the story. How did you learn to see that kind of courage? I almost didn't, Margaret admitted. There was a translator named Lynn who worked with our medical team. She was small, very quiet, and she always seemed to fade into the background when decisions were being made. I barely noticed her for the first month she was with us. Margaret's voice grew softer as she continued the story. One day, we were treating a severely wounded Vietnamese civilian who was screaming in pain and terror. None of us could calm him down because we couldn't communicate with him effectively. Lynn stepped forward and began speaking to him in his local dialect, which was different from standard Vietnamese. She held his hand and talked to him softly while we worked, and I watched this terrified, pain-crazed man become calm and cooperative. Dr. Mitchell found himself completely absorbed in the story, his notebook forgotten on the table beside him. Later, I learned that Lynn had recognized the man's dialect as being from a village that was controlled by forces opposed to the American presence. By helping us treat him, she was risking being labeled a traitor by people from her own region. But she did it anyway because she saw a human being in pain who needed help. Margaret paused, letting the implications of the story settle with her listeners. That's when I realized that I had been looking for courage in all the wrong places. I was watching for the obvious heroes while completely missing the quiet ones who were making just as much difference, sometimes more. Dr. Torres appeared at their table, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the lobby. I'm sorry I'm late. I was on a call with my attending back at the hospital, telling him about your presentation. He wants to invite you to speak to our entire emergency department staff. Margaret smiled, but shook her head gently. That's very kind, but I think the real work happens in conversations like this one. Large presentations can inspire, but real change happens when people take time to reflect on their own experiences and challenge their own assumptions. Dr. Torres pulled up another chair, creating a small circle around the table. Actually, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Your presentation made me realize that I've been carrying around some assumptions about my own patients that I need to examine. She looked around the table at her colleagues before continuing. I work in an emergency room in a primarily Latino neighborhood, and I speak Spanish fluently. I always thought that gave me some special insight into my patients' needs and experiences. But listening to you talk about seeing humanity rather than categories made me realize that I might be making assumptions about people based on their ethnicity or language, even positive assumptions. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Can you give me an example? Well, I always assumed that older Latino patients want their families heavily involved in medical decisions. I automatically include multiple family members in discussions and defer to what I perceive as cultural preferences. But last week, I had an elderly woman who kept trying to speak privately with me, and I kept redirecting the conversation to include her daughter. Finally, she grabbed my arm and whispered that she needed to tell me something that she couldn't say in front of her family. Dr. Torres paused, the memory clearly troubling her. It turned out that she was being financially abused by that same daughter, and the stress was contributing to her medical problems. But because I was so focused on what I thought were her cultural expectations, I almost missed a serious case of elder abuse. The table fell silent as the implications of this story sank in. Each of the young doctors was beginning to see how their own good intentions and supposed cultural sensitivity might sometimes create barriers rather than bridges. Dr. Torres, Margaret said finally, what you're describing is something I see often in medical settings. We mean well when we try to be culturally sensitive, but sometimes we end up treating people as representatives of their culture rather than as individuals who happen to belong to that culture. She shifted in her chair, her metal catching the lobby's afternoon light filtering through tall windows. In Vietnam, I learned that assumptions based on nationality, culture, or appearance could be deadly. But I also learned that the opposite extreme, trying to ignore all cultural and social factors, could be just as dangerous. The key is finding the balance between cultural awareness and individual recognition. Dr. Kim spoke up again, her voice more confident now. So how do we find that balance in practical terms? When I'm working in the emergency room and I have 30 patients waiting and 15 minutes to make a diagnosis, how do I avoid making assumptions while still being efficient? Margaret considered this carefully. It was the central challenge of emergency medicine, providing individualized care while managing time constraints and high patient volumes. I think it starts with changing the questions we ask ourselves, she replied. Instead of looking at a patient and asking, what type of person is this? Try asking, what does this particular person need from me right now? It's a subtle difference, but it can lead to very different approaches to care. An elderly man approached their table then, walking with a cane and moving slowly but deliberately. He wore a simple veteran's cap and a cardigan that had seen better years. The group of young doctors glanced up at him, then looked to Margaret to see if she minded the interruption. Excuse me, the man said quietly. Are you Dr. Margaret Shun? I attended your presentation this afternoon. Margaret stood up immediately, her expression warm and welcoming. Yes, I am. Please, would you like to join us? I think we have room for one more chair. The man's eyes brightened as he settled into the chair that Dr. Mitchell had quickly pulled over from a nearby table. Thank you. I am Robert Martinez. I'm a veteran myself, Korea, and I wanted to tell you how much your story meant to me. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've been going to VA hospitals for 60 years, and I've seen how medical people treat veterans. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But what you said about seeing the human being first, that's important. Margaret nodded, recognizing something in the older man's demeanor that suggested he had his own difficult stories to tell. I wanted to tell these young doctors something, Robert continued, looking around the table at the residents. When I go to the emergency room now, I know I don't look like much. I'm old, I'm slow, and my clothes aren't fancy. But inside this old body is someone who once carried wounded Marines off a battlefield in Korea. Inside every patient you see is someone who has a story, who has been brave in ways you might never know about. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his attention completely focused on the older man. Mr. Martinez, how can we, as doctors, make sure we're seeing that story? How can we make sure we're treating you with the respect you deserve? Robert smiled, the question clearly pleasing him. Just ask, not necessarily about my military service, but about me as a person. When I come to the emergency room with chest pain, don't just ask about my symptoms. Ask about my concerns, my fears, what I need to feel safe and heard. Dr. Kim found herself thinking about her grandmother again, wondering what stories might have emerged if someone had simply asked the right questions with genuine interest and respect. Mr. Martinez, she said, would you be willing to share what kinds of questions make you feel most comfortable when you're seeking medical care? Robert's face lit up. Now that's a good question. I like it when doctors ask about my pain level, but also about how the pain affects my daily life. I like it when they explain what they're going to do before they do it. And I really appreciate it when they ask if there's anything else I'm worried about, because sometimes the thing that brought me to the hospital isn't the thing I'm most scared of. Margaret watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of dialogue she had hoped her presentation might spark, conversations that bridged the gap between medical professionals and the people they served. Mr. Martinez raises an important point, she said. Often, the presenting complaint is just the tip of the iceberg. The elderly woman who comes in with vague abdominal pain might really be scared that she's becoming a burden on her family. The middle-aged man with chest pain might be terrified of leaving his children without a father. When we address only the medical symptoms without acknowledging the human fears, we're only treating half the problem. The conversation continued for another hour, with other medical professionals occasionally joining the discussion. A nurse from pediatric oncology talked about how she had learned to see the person behind devastating diagnoses. A paramedic shared stories about making split-second decisions about treatment based on incomplete information. A medical student from rural Montana discussed the challenges of providing culturally appropriate care in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. As the afternoon light began to fade through the conference center windows, Margaret finally stood up from the table. Her day had been long, and the emotional weight of the conversations was beginning to show in her posture. "I should probably get some rest before dinner," she said apologetically. "But I want to thank all of you for this conversation. This is exactly why I continue to speak at conferences, not for the formal presentations, but for moments like these where we can really listen to each other and learn." Dr. Mitchell stood up as well, extending his hand to Margaret. "Dr. Chun, I want to thank you for your patience with us today, but more than that, I want to thank you for the example you've set. I'm going to be a better doctor because of what you've taught me." Margaret shook his hand warmly. Dr. Mitchell, the fact that you're willing to examine your own assumptions and change your approach tells me that you are already on your way to being a better doctor. Today just gave you some tools to get there faster. As the group began to disperse, Dr. Kim lingered for a moment. "Dr. Chun, would it be appropriate to ask you about something personal?" Margaret nodded, settling back into her chair. "The medal you wear, I've been curious about it all day. Not the Medal of Honor itself, but why you wear it. Most recipients I've read about don't wear their medals regularly." Margaret looked down at her wrist, touching the small bronze circle gently. "I wear it as a reminder," she said simply. "Not of what I did, but of what I learned. Every time I feel myself making assumptions about someone, every time I catch myself judging based on appearance or first impressions, I feel this medal and remember that moment in the field hospital when I had to choose between seeing an enemy and seeing a patient." She paused, her voice growing softer. "It reminds me that the most important decisions we make are often the ones where we choose compassion over convenience, understanding over assumption, curiosity over judgment." Dr. Kim nodded, understanding finally why this small piece of metal had played such an important role in the day's events. As Margaret finally gathered her things and headed toward the elevators, she left behind a lobby full of medical professionals who were still deep in conversation, still processing the lessons of the day, still discovering new ways to see the humanity in every patient who would cross their paths in the days and years to come. 3 weeks after the Chicago conference, Dr. Sarah Kim stood in the emergency room at Chicago General Hospital, facing a situation that would test everything she had learned from Margaret Chin. It was a busy Friday evening, and the waiting room was packed with patients ranging from construction workers with minor injuries to elderly patients with chest pain, from anxious parents with fevering children to homeless individuals seeking shelter from the October cold. The patient in bed 7 was causing quite a stir among the nursing staff. Maria Santos, a 52-year-old woman, had arrived by ambulance complaining of severe abdominal pain. She spoke limited English, was dressed in a housekeeper's uniform from a local hotel, and had no insurance card or identification when the paramedics brought her in. The nurse who had initially triaged her had made several assumptions about her case, noting in the chart that the patient appeared to be seeking pain medication and suggesting that her symptoms might be exaggerated. Dr. Kim approached the bed with Maria's chart in hand, but instead of reading it first, she decided to try something different. She pulled up a chair next to the bed and sat down at eye level with her patient, remembering Margaret's words about seeing the person before seeing the category. "Hola, Mrs. Santos," Dr. Kim began in her college-level Spanish. Dr. Kim, can you tell me what brought you here today?" Maria's eyes, which had been tight with pain and wariness, softened slightly at hearing her native language. In halting Spanish mixed with English, she began to describe pain that had started 3 days earlier, but had become unbearable during her shift cleaning hotel rooms. As Maria talked, Dr. Kim found herself really listening, not just to the medical symptoms, but to the story behind them. She heard about a woman who had been working double shifts to save money to bring her teenage son from Guatemala to join her in Chicago. She learned about someone who had been avoiding medical care because she couldn't afford it, but who had finally come to the hospital because the pain was so severe she couldn't stand up. "Mrs. Santos," Dr. Kim said gently, "I can see that you're in real pain, and I want to help you. But I need to examine you to understand what's causing it. Is that okay?" The physical examination revealed what the nursing staff had missed in their rush to judgment. Maria's symptoms weren't consistent with drug-seeking behavior at all. Instead, they suggested a possible gallbladder infection that could become life-threatening if left untreated. Dr. Kim ordered blood tests and an ultrasound, then returned to sit with Maria while they waited for results. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that we're going to take good care of you. Your symptoms suggest something serious, but it's something we can treat." Tears of relief started flowing down Maria's cheeks. "Thank you, doctor. I was so scared no one would believe me." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. James Mitchell, who had been observing from a nurse's station. He approached the bed with obvious curiosity about Dr. Kim's patient-centered approach. "Sarah," he said quietly, "can I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped away from the bed, and Dr. Mitchell looked back at Maria with a thoughtful expression. "I have to admit, when I saw her chart and the nurse's notes, I assumed she was probably drug-seeking. How did you know to look deeper?" Dr. Kim smiled, thinking of Margaret Chun. "I remembered something Dr. Chun said about changing the questions we ask. Instead of asking, 'What type of patient is this?' I asked, 'What does this person need from me right now?' And then I actually listened to the answer." The ultrasound confirmed Dr. Kim's suspicions. Maria had acute cholangitis, a serious infection of the bile ducts that required immediate antibiotic treatment and surgical intervention. What the nursing staff had dismissed as drug-seeking behavior was actually a woman in severe, legitimate pain from a condition that could have killed her if left untreated. Dr. Mitchell watched as Dr. Kim carefully explained the diagnosis to Maria in Spanish, taking time to answer her questions and address her fears about the cost of treatment. The transformation in both doctor and patient was remarkable. Maria's relief at being believed and properly treated was evident, while Dr. Kim's confidence in her diagnostic abilities had clearly grown. "You know what's interesting?" Dr. Mitchell said to Dr. Kim as they completed Maria's admission paperwork. 3 weeks ago, I probably would have looked at her chart, seen the nurse's assumptions, and moved on to the next patient without really examining her thoroughly. Dr. Chin's presentation has been bothering me in the best possible way." Dr. Kim nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I've been thinking about it constantly. Every patient I see, I hear her voice asking me what assumptions I'm making." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Rachel Torres, who approached them with a folder full of patient charts and an expression of frustrated exhaustion. "We've got a problem in room 12, she announced. "Elderly homeless man, brought in by police for altered mental status. He's dirty, smells like alcohol, and he's been verbally combative with the nursing staff. Security wants to know if we can clear him quickly so they can take him back to the street." Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Kim exchanged a look. 3 weeks ago, this would have been a routine case, processed quickly with minimal investigation. But Margaret Chin's words echoed in both their minds. "What's his name?" Dr. Kim asked. Dr. Torres looked surprised by the question. Thomas Wilson, I think." "What? Let's go talk to him," Dr. Mitchell suggested. "All 3 of us. I want to try something." The 3 residents approached room 12 together, where they found a man who indeed looked exactly as Dr. Torres had described. Thomas Wilson appeared to be in his 70s, with unkempt hair and clothes that clearly hadn't been washed in weeks. He was sitting on the edge of the examination bed, muttering to himself and occasionally shouting at the nurses who tried to approach him. But instead of maintaining their distance, Dr. Mitchell pulled up a chair and sat down near the bed, just as he had watched Dr. Kim do with Maria Santos. "Mr. Wilson," he said quietly, "I'm Dr. Mitchell. I understand you're having a difficult day." Thomas stopped muttering and looked up with suspicion. "You're going to kick me out like the others, aren't you? Tell me I'm just a drunk who's wasting your time." "Actually, no," Dr. Mitchell replied calmly. "I'm here because I think you might need medical help, and I want to understand what's been happening with you." Something in his tone seemed to reach Thomas. The older man's aggressive posture softened slightly, and He began to speak more coherently. "I used to be a teacher," Thomas said quietly. "High school mathematics. Taught for 37 years before I retired." Dr. Torres felt her assumptions beginning to crumble as she listened. "What happened?" Dr. Kim asked gently, pulling up her own chair. Thomas's story unfolded slowly, with many pauses and some confusion, but the basic outline became clear. He had developed early-stage dementia after retiring, which had led to financial problems when he could no longer manage his affairs properly. The loss of his apartment had led to life on the streets, and the stress and poor nutrition had accelerated his cognitive decline. "The drinking," he admitted with obvious shame. "It makes the confusion go away for a while. Makes me forget that I used to be somebody important." Dr. Mitchell felt something shift inside his chest as he realized what they were seeing. This wasn't a simple case of alcohol intoxication that could be quickly discharged. This was a man experiencing cognitive decline, malnutrition, and probably several other medical conditions that were being masked by his appearance and circumstances. "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Torres said, her earlier frustration replaced by genuine concern, "when was the last time you had a thorough medical examination?" Thomas had to think about this for several minutes. "Maybe 2 years ago? 3? It's hard to remember." The resident spent the next 2 hours with Thomas, conducting a comprehensive evaluation that revealed multiple serious medical issues. In addition to signs of dementia and malnutrition, he had diabetes that had gone untreated for months, high blood pressure, and early signs of kidney problems. "You know what's remarkable?" Dr. Kim said as they reviewed Thomas's test results. "If we had processed him quickly like security wanted, we would have missed all of this. He would have been back on the street tonight, probably dead within a few weeks from diabetic complications." Dr. Mitchell nodded, thinking about the chain of events that had led them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, that's exactly what would have happened. We would have seen a drunk homeless man instead of a retired teacher with multiple treatable medical conditions. Their reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference director from Chicago, who had come to Chicago General to observe their emergency department as part of a research project. She had heard about the changes in approach among some of the residents and wanted to see the results firsthand. "Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Kim, Dr. Torres," she said, approaching their workstation. "I understand you've been implementing some new patient care protocols based on Dr. Chen's presentation. How has that been working out?" Dr. Torres gestured toward room 12, where Thomas Wilson was now resting comfortably after being admitted for comprehensive medical care. "See that patient? 3 weeks ago, he would have been discharged to the street within an hour. Today, we discovered that he's a retired mathematics teacher with treatable diabetes, hypertension, and early dementia who needs social services intervention and ongoing medical care." Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow with interest. "What changed your approach?" "We changed the questions we asked," Dr. Kim explained. "Instead of looking at him and asking, 'How do we get rid of this problem?' we asked, 'What does this person need from us?' And then we actually took the time to find out." Dr. Williams made notes as they talked, clearly impressed by what she was hearing. "Have you seen similar results with other patients?" Dr. Mitchell told her about Maria Santos, whose gallbladder infection might have been missed if they had accepted the initial nursing assessment without question. Dr. Kim shared stories of other cases where taking extra time to really listen to patients had led to better diagnoses and outcomes. "What's interesting," Dr. Torres added, "is that we were worried this approach would slow us down and reduce our efficiency. But it's actually had the opposite effect. When we spend 5 extra minutes really understanding a patient's situation up front, we make better decisions and avoid the delays that come from misdiagnoses and incomplete assessments." Dr. Williams continued taking notes, but she looked up with a smile. "Dr. Chun asked me to check on how things were going here. She said she suspected her presentation might have planted some seeds that would grow into real changes in patient care." "She asked about us specifically?" Dr. Kim asked with surprise. "She remembers all 3 of you quite well," Dr. Williams replied. "She said that the doctors who are most willing to acknowledge their mistakes are usually the ones most likely to learn from them." The residents spent the next hour talking with Dr. Williams about the changes they had observed in their own practice and in their department. They discussed specific cases, new protocols they were trying, and the challenges of implementing patient-centered care in a high-volume emergency department. "One thing that's really struck me," Dr. Mitchell said, "is how much more satisfying the work has become. When you really connect with patients as people rather than just treating them as medical problems, It reminds you why you wanted to become a doctor in the first place. Dr. Torres nodded enthusiastically. And the patients respond differently, too. When they feel heard and respected, they're more cooperative with treatment, more honest about their symptoms, and more likely to follow up with care. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the waiting room. A well-dressed businessman was demanding immediate attention for what he claimed was a heart attack, insisting that his insurance status and prominent position in the community should move him to the front of the line. "Let me handle this," Dr. Kim said, recognizing an opportunity to put Margaret's lessons into practice once again. She approached the agitated man with calm professionalism. "Sir, I'm Dr. Kim. I understand your concern about chest pain, and I want to make sure we address that properly. Can you describe your symptoms for me?" The man immediately began listing his credentials and demanding preferential treatment, but Dr. Kim maintained her patient, professional demeanor. "I can see that you're frightened," she said gently, "and chest pain can definitely be scary. Let's focus on getting you the medical care you need. Can you tell me when the pain started and what it feels like?" As she guided the conversation back to medical issues rather than social status, the man began to calm down. His symptoms, while concerning to him, were more consistent with anxiety and acid reflux than with cardiac problems. But Dr. Kim took the time to explain her assessment thoroughly and arrange appropriate follow-up care. Dr. Williams watched this interaction with obvious approval. "That was beautifully handled," she told Dr. Kim afterward. "You managed to address his medical concerns while maintaining professional boundaries, regardless of his attempts to leverage his social status." Dr. Chin taught us that every patient deserves the same level of respect and attention, Dr. Kim replied. "Whether they're a homeless man with dementia or a businessman with anxiety, our job is to provide the best medical care we can based on their actual needs, not their perceived importance." As the evening wore on, more examples of the residents' changed approach became evident. They spent extra time with a young mother whose child had a fever, helping her understand when to worry and when to use home care. They carefully assessed an elderly woman whose family had dismissed her complaints as attention-seeking, discovering that she was experiencing the early signs of a stroke. By the end of their shift, Dr. Williams had documented numerous examples of improved patient care directly attributable to the lessons learned from Margaret Chin's presentation. "You know what I'm going to do?" she told the three residents as they completed their shift notes. "I'm going to recommend that Dr. Chin's presentation be shown to medical students and residents across the country. What you've demonstrated here tonight is that her message isn't just inspirational, it's practical. It actually improves medical outcomes." Dr. Mitchell looked at his colleagues with a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply completing another shift. 3 weeks ago, we were the doctors making assumptions about an elderly woman with manila folders, he said. Tonight, we were the doctors asking better questions and providing better care because of what she taught us. Dr. Torres gathered her things with a thoughtful expression. "I wonder if she knows how much she's changed the way we practice medicine." "I think she does," Dr. Kim replied, remembering the wisdom in Margaret's eyes during their conversation in the conference center lobby. "I think she's been planting these seeds her whole career, waiting for them to grow into better doctors and better patient care." As they left the hospital that night, each of the residents carried with them not just the satisfaction of a job well done, but the knowledge that they were becoming the kind of doctors they had always hoped to be. The ripple effects of Margaret Chin's presentation were spreading far beyond a single conference, creating waves of change that would touch countless patients in the years to come. 6 months later, Dr. Margaret Chin received an invitation that would bring her story full circle. The American College of Emergency Physicians had asked her to return to Chicago, not for another conference presentation, but to witness something unprecedented in medical education history. Chicago General Hospital had become the first major medical center in the country to implement what they were calling the Chun Protocol, a comprehensive approach to patient care that emphasized seeing the person behind the medical condition. The protocol had been developed by Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Torres, working with their department chief and the hospital administration, and the results had been remarkable enough to attract national attention. Margaret stood in the observation deck overlooking the emergency department, watching the afternoon shift handle the typical chaos of a busy urban hospital. But something was different about the energy in the room. Despite the obvious pressure and high patient volume, there was a calmness to the interactions between staff and patients that was unusual in such a high-stress environment. Dr. Chun, said Dr. Patricia Williams, who had accompanied her for this visit, I want you to see what your presentation has accomplished. Through the glass, Margaret watched Dr. Sarah Kim working with an elderly Hispanic man who had arrived by ambulance. Instead of hurrying through a quick assessment, Dr. Kim had pulled up a chair and was speaking with the patient in Spanish, her posture relaxed and attentive despite the obvious urgency of other cases waiting for attention. His name is Eduardo Morales, Dr. Williams explained, reading from tablet. He's been to this emergency room 4 times in the past month with chest pain, and each time he's been discharged with anxiety medications and instructions to follow up with his primary care doctor. Margaret watched as Dr. Kim continued her conversation with Mr. Morales, noting how the patient's tense posture gradually relaxed as he felt heard and understood. Dr. Kim spent 20 minutes with him, not just asking about his chest pain, but about his life circumstances. She discovered that he's been caring for his wife who has advanced Alzheimer's disease, and the stress of watching her decline has been causing panic attacks that feel exactly like heart problems. Through the glass, Margaret could see Dr. Kim writing notes, but she was also making arrangements for social services consultation and connecting Mr. Morales with resources for caregivers of dementia patients. The old protocol would have been another anxiety medication prescription and a quick discharge, Dr. Williams continued. The Chun protocol requires staff to ask not just about symptoms, but about the human being experiencing those symptoms. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she watched the scene unfold. This was exactly what she had hoped might happen when she shared her story about the battlefield hospital in Vietnam, but seeing it implemented on such a scale was more than she had dared to dream. Dr. James Mitchell appeared in the emergency department below, approaching a bed where a homeless woman was being treated for what appeared to be a minor infection. Margaret watched as he introduced himself and sat down at eye level with the patient, just as she had seen Dr. Kim do months earlier. That's Jennifer Walsh, Dr. Williams noted. She's what we used to call a frequent flyer, someone who came to the emergency room regularly for minor complaints. Under the old system, she would typically be treated quickly and discharged without much investigation into underlying issues. Margaret watched Dr. Mitchell's patient interaction with growing interest. His approach was unhurried and respectful, treating the homeless woman with the same professional courtesy he would show any other patient. Dr. Mitchell discovered that Jennifer has been living with untreated diabetes for years, managing her symptoms by coming to the emergency room whenever she felt sick. Instead of just treating her immediate complaint and sending her away, he's working with our social services team to get her enrolled in a diabetes management program and connect her with stable housing resources. The transformation Margaret was witnessing wasn't just in individual patient interactions. The entire culture of the emergency department seemed to have shifted. Nurses were spending more time listening to patients' concerns. Residents were consulting with each other more frequently, sharing insights about the human stories behind medical presentations. Support staff were treating every patient with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or social circumstances. Dr. Chun, Dr. Williams said, "I need to show you something else." They walked down a corridor lined with patient feedback forms and quality improvement charts. But instead of the typical metrics about wait times and patient satisfaction scores, these displays showed something different. We started tracking what we call diagnostic accuracy improvement, Dr. Williams explained, pointing to a graph that showed steadily climbing numbers over the past 6 months. When doctors spend more time understanding patients as people rather than just collections of symptoms, they make better medical decisions. Margaret studied the data with fascination. The numbers showed significant improvements in diagnostic accuracy, reduced readmission rates, and decreased medical errors. But perhaps more importantly, they also showed improvements in patient satisfaction and staff morale. The Chun protocol has actually made us more efficient, not less, Dr. Williams continued. When you take 5 extra minutes to really understand a patient's situation up front, you avoid the much longer delays that come from misdiagnosis, repeated visits, and incomplete treatment plans. They were joined by Dr. Rachel Torres, who had been leading a training session for new residents on the Chun protocol principles. Dr. Chun, she said with obvious excitement, "I can't believe you're here. We've been documenting everything we've learned from implementing your approach, and the results have exceeded our wildest expectations." Dr. Torres led them to a conference room where she had prepared a comprehensive presentation on the Chun protocol's impact. The data was impressive, but What struck Margaret most were the personal stories that accompanied the statistics. We have a patient named Michael Rodriguez who came in 6 months ago, presenting as an aggressive, non-compliant drug seeker, Dr. Torres began. Under our old approach, he would have been given minimal treatment and quickly discharged. But using Chun protocol principles, Dr. Kim discovered that he's a veteran with PTSD who was self-medicating with street drugs because he couldn't navigate the VA system to get proper mental health care. Margaret listened as Dr. Torres described how Michael was now in a comprehensive treatment program, had stable housing, and was working part-time as a peer counselor for other veterans struggling with similar issues. Then, there's Sarah Thompson, a well-dressed businesswoman who came in demanding immediate attention for migraine headaches. Our old approach might have given her preferential treatment based on her apparent social status. Instead, Dr. Mitchell treated her exactly the same as every other patient, which meant really listening to her concerns and investigating thoroughly. Dr. Torres clicked to the next slide, which showed before and after photos of a woman who looked dramatically different in each image. It turned out that Sarah's migraines were actually symptoms of a brain tumor that had been misdiagnosed by other doctors who made assumptions about stress-related headaches in high-achieving women. Because Dr. Mitchell didn't let her social status influence his medical judgment either positively or negatively, he ordered the appropriate tests and potentially save her life. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized the profound impact that her simple story about treating an enemy soldier had created. The ripple effect had spread far beyond anything she could have anticipated. But the most remarkable change, Dr. Torres continued, has been in our staff. Doctors and nurses who are experiencing burnout and compassion fatigue have rediscovered their passion for medicine. When you approach each patient as a unique human being with their own story, the work becomes meaningful again. Dr. Williams pulled up additional data on her tablet. We've had requests from over 30 hospitals across the country to implement similar protocols. Medical schools are incorporating Chun protocol training into their curricula. The approach is spreading beyond emergency medicine into other specialties.